Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Dennis Stone, Director of the Center for Advocacy and Social Justice at the Jacksonville Urban League. And tonight we're having one in a series of uh, town halls that are focused on the impact of recent budgetary changes, recent changes in immigration laws, uh, and health law changes that impacts the community we serve and the community uh, in Jacksonville and in Florida generally. And tonight we have some great speakers for you, and I'm going to turn it over to Eva Zeltzer, one of our interns at the center, to do the introduction and facilitate the program. Also with us tonight is Sadia Barge, Gabrielle Davis, and Leslie Kaplan. So, Eva.
Thank you, Dennis. Yes, hi everyone. I'm Eva. I'm one of the interns in addition to Samantha, who wasn't able to make it tonight, but we're working with two amazing speakers to bring this event to you all. So as Dennis mentioned, this is an event out of many where we're hoping to educate the Jacksonville community and the broader US community about pertinent topics. And today's topic is immigration. We have two amazing speakers talking about immigration through two different lenses. Dr. Madeline Zavodny is going to be taking an economic lens, while Dr. Juan Salinas is going to be taking a more sociological lens. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our amazing speakers. With us, we have Dr. Zavodny, who is a professor of economics at the University of North Florida here in Jacksonville. She earned her PhD in economics from MIT and has spent several years researching how immigration intersects with labor markets and public policy. Previously, she worked as an economist with the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta and Dallas, and she's been a consultant for the Congressional Budget Office and the World Bank, among others. Her work isn't just academic, it's based on real world impact. And given the current state of affairs, Dr. Zavodny's work offers critical insight into the ongoing dialogue about the implications of immigration policy. So Dr. Zavodny is going to be presenting first in our event, but I'm also going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Juan Salinas, who will be going after. Dr. Juan Salinas is an assistant professor of sociology in the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Social Work at the University of North Florida as well. He received his PhD from the Texas A&M University, his MA from the University at Hawaii, and his BA from the University of Tennessee. Dr. Salinas's research and teaching interests include race and ethnicity, racism, immigration, labor, and health inequalities, and he works closely with minority and immigrant communities to address their employment and health concerns. So, like I mentioned, we're going to be coming at this from two different lenses, and we're going to get started first with Dr. Zavodny, who's going to talk us through the economics of immigration in the US.
Thank you, Eva. I want to thank you all for having me. I'm really honored to be with you, particularly on the anniversary of John Lewis's birthday, as we remember him and his memory, and maybe we'll make a little good trouble today. All right, so what I'm going to begin with is sort of the big picture here of how immigrants fit into our economy, especially the labor force. I'm a labor economist, and so I often, as I tell my students, I have a hammer and everything is a nail. That is the labor market. So with that in mind, that's one caveat. The other caveat that I have is, Professor Salinas and I are professors. And so therefore we do have slides. And so with that, I will share my slides with you. And this is a lot like, a mini version of one of my classes where I put up a picture and normally the class and I would talk about it. Here, it's really just going to be me talking about it, but we will have time certainly at the end for some dialogue, I hope. All right, so what this first figure shows you is the size and share of the foreign-born population in the United States by decade, going all the way back before the Civil War. So from 1850 through 2020, and then adding the most recent year for which we have data, which is 2024. The blue bars refer to the left axis, and they're showing you the number of foreign-born So that's basically immigrants in millions. The red line there is the share of the population, and the numbers for that as a percent are over.
I'm sorry.
Are over on the right axis. Okay. So that's what's going on in the figure. What the takeaway from here, I think, and that goes along with the title, is that the foreign-born population was growing at a fairly brisk clip. I think when we get the next data point for 2025 in this, that's almost certainly no longer going to be true. So that's why the was, that it is almost certain that in 2025, we will actually see the foreign-born population in the United States shrink. But as of where we are at the beginning of this year was a record high in terms of size, and about 51 million foreign-born people living and often working in the United States. Well, of course, the whole US population, is bigger than it's ever been before. So that being a record isn't that big of a deal. But what is also a record is that our foreign-born share of the population at over 15% was also at a record size. One thing that's not shown here in the figure, but I think is important to understand, is that about half of the foreign-born are naturalized US citizens. About another quarter of them are what are called legal or lawful permanent residents. You'll sometimes hear this called green card holders. So that leaves only about a quarter who either are here on a temporary visa, maybe they have a temporary work visa. You'll sometimes hear these like as H-1B, H-2A, H-2B, and so on. Or they're an international student with a student visa. Or in some cases, they lack a visa at all and maybe are here with humanitarian protections, or maybe are here with no protections at all, what I would call unauthorized immigrants, but other people might call undocumented or illegal. Right, so that's probably about a quarter at most of the foreign-born population that the media is very, very, very intensely focused on. Now, interestingly to me, I've been doing this for quite a while, right? And if I think back about, if I were giving this talk 2 decades ago, it was kind of like, oh, it's about a third, a third, a third, right? So what has happened just over the last couple of decades is that a lot more people who were eligible to become naturalized citizens did. And at the same time, the share of the foreign-born population that's unauthorized has actually been falling until very recently. Part of this was an effect of the 2006 Great Recession. So in 2007 through 2009, we had a drop in the unauthorized immigrant population, and growth really didn't begin to resume in the unauthorized population until the pandemic. So what happened with the pandemic? Well, March of 2020, right, the borders basically just slammed closed. And this became a big challenge for border enforcement officials, so Customs and Border Protection. So what were they going to do with migrants who were apprehended crossing the border? President Trump, in his first administration, implemented something called, or invoked something called Title 42. It basically was that Customs and Border Protection could push back migrants into Mexico if Mexico was willing to take them. And Mexico wasn't willing to take immigrants from all countries, only primarily their own, and those from other Central American countries. So what ended up happening was that some immigrants who crossed the border and weren't apprehended disappeared into the United States. Others who were apprehended had to be released because there was sort of nothing else to do with them. And then other immigrants learned that if they were caught, if you will, by Customs and Border Patrol, by Border Patrol, what they should do is ask for amnesty, because there was no way that amnesty claim could be weighed very quickly, particularly in the context of the pandemic. So people learned that it almost felt like a loophole to some of them. And so what started to happen was what economists referred to as the surge. Very large inflows of people coming across the border and then asking for amnesty, right? And so this is what this second figure here is showing you. It's annual data of estimates from the Congressional Budget Office of the net inflow coming into the United States in 3 different categories. The blue here is legal permanent residents. So this is people entering the United States with a green card or already here and transitioning into green card status. The gray is non-immigrants. So that's people who are coming in on a temporary visa. And it's the net inflow of those. So again, those international students, temporary workers, things like that. The red is the interesting part. And so the euphemism that the Congressional Budget Office used instead of unauthorized immigrants here is other foreign nationals. And what you see at the very tail end over there, right, those last few years, is it just surged, right? These enormous increases. Now, part of this, again, was people who crossed the border and weren't apprehended at all. There were people who crossed the border. They maybe even sought out Border Patrol, and then they asked for amnesty. But another thing that contributed to this was that as there was this surge coming across the border, the Biden administration tried to get it under control by creating ways to allow people to enter legally and give them some humanitarian protections, again, in order to try to get the border under control. So the most biggest example of this is that the Biden administration created a program called CHNV, Cuban, Haitian, Nicaraguan, and Venezuelan, that you could be admitted into the United States if you had a sponsor here. And you kind of had a temporary legal right to be in the United States. You could work legally in the United States. And the idea here was that we would discourage people from entering illegally, screen them before they came, and they had connections here within the United States. Of course, the Trump administration very promptly has ended CHNV and is starting to revoke lots of these humanitarian protections. But even before that happened, by mid-2024, the Biden administration was beginning to crack down on the border by making it more difficult to get amnesty, or to ask for amnesty, at least, if you were caught crossing illegally. Well, it turned out to be too late, of course, for the Democratic Party, given that Trump won the election. And we're now at basically a near halt in terms of inflows coming into the United States. So this is estimates of the number of the net inflow of unauthorized immigrants on a monthly basis going back to October of 2013. So you see the run up, that's the surge, and then you see the drop off. And again, the drop off predates Trump coming back into office. It's really reflecting that the US began working with Mexico to have Mexico make it much harder for people to move north to the US-Mexico border. And then again, discouraging people from entering by making it hard to ask for amnesty. Okay, so that's sort of the picture of where we are in terms of this surge. It was huge. It's largely over. But again, in the context of the entire foreign-born population in the United States, I don't know that it's really necessarily such a big deal, because most foreign-born who are here legally, they're naturalized citizens, or they have lawful permanent residence, a green card. Okay, so let's step back a little bit and think about why people come to the United States. Some come because conditions in their home country are very unsafe. They're seeking out safety. Some have family in the United States. Maybe they have a spouse, maybe their children, friends or whatever are here. And so they're coming for friends and family. They're coming for better lives, of course. Most people who come here are coming for a job. And interestingly, those who come are in many ways very similar to US natives, but they do differ on average in some very important ways. One of those is education. Okay, so this slide is showing among adult people living in the United States and in the labor force who are likely to have completed their education already. So they're 25 and older. The distribution of the US born across 4 education groups and the distribution of the foreign born across the same 4 education groups. So these are shares. So like looking over at the right, over 40% of US born adults in the labor force say they have at least a bachelor's degree or higher. a very slightly smaller share of the foreign-born say they have a bachelor's degree or higher. So again, in some ways, they're similar. The big difference is down here over on the left, the group that has not completed high school. So they either don't have a diploma, don't have a GED, or whatever the equivalent would be in their home country. The share of adult US born people who have not completed high school is minuscule at this point. It's well below 5%. Among the foreign born, it's at about 20%. It's a very substantial difference. All right, so why so many foreign born who have low levels of education? Well, part of it is that they're coming from countries where levels of education are relatively low. But also, there are good opportunities often in the United States for them, right? In part because there are fewer and fewer US born workers over time who are willing and able to fill the types of jobs that don't require much education. So think about picking crops, being a construction laborer, working in some leisure and hospitality jobs. These are very physically demanding jobs. They require skill, but it's not the type of formal skills you necessarily learn in school. But employers have very strong demand for these types of workers, particularly coming out of the pandemic. So this was a snapshot of the US labor force. Thinking a little bit about changes in it, this is a slightly different way of viewing the same data. What this is showing is since 2010, the change in terms of millions of people in each of those four education groups, again, by whether they're US born or foreign born. So what's interesting to see here is that except for college graduates with at least a bachelor's degree, every education group for US born has been shrinking. For the foreign born, it's a little bit different, right? We see growth in 3 of the 4 categories, but even the foreign born down in this bottom category, the number of foreign born workers in the US who are not high school graduates has actually been shrinking over time, right? And again, there's very strong demand by employers for this, for these types of workers. And this is somewhat stunning, I think, when you think about the future of the labor market and what types of jobs, particularly given who knows what will happen with AI, but if AI begins to replace lots of more of jobs that are typically filled by very highly educated workers, but jobs that are very people intensive and can't be offshored, right? You can't import your home healthcare aid from Mexico. You you can have them immigrate and do the job here, but you can't import the service in the same way as you can, say, a tomato or an avocado, right? That we're going to have very big increases in demand for in many cases, for occupations that we would typically think of as not requiring a lot of formal education, while our labor force has very much moved into the opposite direction. Okay. The last point that I want to give you is what I view as the scary slide. And it's this. This is again from the Congressional Budget Office. And what it is showing is the contribution to population growth in the United States from what's called the natural increase. That's the blue part, births minus deaths. And then from net immigration. So that's growth on net of the foreign-born population. That's the gray part, right? And so the black line is just adding up the two, it's total population growth. So these are estimates that the Congressional Budget Office put out in January of 2025 using data from 2024 and earlier. So this is sort of their best guess as to what they thought was going to happen. And what they were saying, was that 6 months ago, was that by 2033, the US born population would be shrinking. And all of our growth would have to come from net immigration. And they thought net immigration was going to be positive and pretty substantial in 2025 and remain kind of at its historical average. Well, when you reassess this now, 6 months later, I'm not sure that you would, I definitely wouldn't say the same for 2025. And who knows what the future holds. And so, again, I view this as a very scary slide because living in a country that has a declining population would be very troubling, not just for our economy, but for what our lives would look like, particularly as we grow older and we need more and more help. Think about who's going to buy your house someday? Who's going to help take care of you? These are things for which we want a growing population. And for that, we're ultimately going to need more immigrants. So, I had to end on that dismal note because economics is the dismal science, but I'm sure that Professor Salinas will bring us back.
Thank you for that, Dr. Zavodny. It's really fascinating to see how much immigration has changed and continues to change in the US. And keeping all of that in mind, let's transition to Dr. Salinas, who's going to sort of use that picture as a foundation to take a more sociological approach.
Great. Sorry. This back up here. There we go. Can everyone see that okay? Okay, great.
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Ava, for that introduction. And thank you, Dr. Zavodny. That's very great insights on the trends and data about, the immigrant population. It's so fascinating to look at the percentage of foreign born across time historically. And I always think about that trend about what happened in the early 20th century when we got to a certain level of foreign born, and that caused all the anti-immigrant laws and policies to come out. And now we're hitting that same level, about 50% or so, and and it's the same trend comes around again. And it's very true about the idea of the population heading. We would already be we wouldn't have population growth if it wasn't for immigrants. So it's a very much needed population in terms of how our economy works. So again, I have a similar kind of setup here. I just have a bunch of slides from some of my classes, and it's cut down a whole lot, but it's basically I do a lot of research on employers and immigrant laborers. And so I do more qualitative research, and I've done interviews and conversations with these folks about what's going on in the labor market and then how people are treated for having an undocumented status. So I'll go over some research in sociology that looks at the exploitation of immigrant laborers, and then just look at some general contemporary labor conditions and healthcare issues, and especially occupational health. And I'll also look at some perspectives from from immigrant day laborers as well as employers. I'm going to get into how they view their workers and how they think about race and immigration, and then ultimately how they're treated. And then also I'll make the case for how employers are caught in this catch-22 and these contradictions of needing the workers, but also going along with anti-immigrant policies that exist. So we'll examine some of those contradictions. So I'll start with some sociological theory. We tend to be pretty, well, Dr. Zavodny was talking about doomsday economics, but in sociology, we're very, very doomsday. We're very, very critical. We don't always have the answer, but we'll point out when there's problems. And I wanted to talk about a little bit about the history. One of the largest migration flows that ever happened in America was the Bracero program. 5 million were brought in between 1940 and 1960s. And it was during the war, and we needed more workers. And these were all brought in legally. And so the US government set up guest worker programs for them to come in. But many theorists have talked about this as a sort of internalized colonialism process. These were folks who had to come from Mexico, cross, and then work, many in the Southwest, but they were all over the country in terms of providing that extra work. And they've developed long-term relationships with employers and agriculture. And a significant portion of our agriculture is tied to many of these workers, and this immigration flow came through. They ended the Bracero program in 1964, and since then, many of the same flow continued and transitioned to being undocumented. Many of these workers continue to come, and we end up getting a similar type of workforce that has emerged. There's been lots of really interesting research on migrant laborers. Here's a few books that look at health and occupational issues. And the issue that they focus on is this problem that they face when they're on the fields and when they're dealing with working under while having an undocumented status and how they are marginalized. Some theorists frame this as structural violence. This is an idea that structures harm people by preventing them from meeting their basic needs, and all sorts of health issues can emerge from it. And what no one really ever talks about is there's not really a lot of health benefits for workers. Oftentimes, they will not provide them things like workers' compensation, and it's kind of like the standard quo of what the labor force rights should be like. Often they don't have access to that, so that causes some of these problems. Another big idea is the concept of the deportation threat dynamic. We have millions of undocumented workers, and they're very vulnerable, very exposed to exploitation, wage theft, underreporting of injuries. And we've really entered this era of mass deportation. It's been going on really for the past couple of decades, where they've, I think, between 1990 and 2020, they have deported around 5 million people. And the past, we got to around 300,000 to 400,000 a year. People talk about like deportation just started and it's on the news, but it's been going on. But it's definitely more visible and more accelerating in more recent times. And so there's this really big problem about what happens when you have millions of workers living under this sort of mass deportation era, and how marginalized they are, and how this causes more of their lack of labor access to rights, and things like that. And this leads to big problems. The most dangerous job in the U.S. is construction. The highest rate of number of fatal work injuries and fatal work injury rates, and agriculture as well. You always hear about certain jobs being or they're framed as like dangerous, like the police officers or things like that, but it's like it's these workers that are like risking their lives in this sort of labor conditions. And many of the times there's been many cases, especially here in Florida, about people reporting injuries, for instance, and then quickly there's been hundreds of these cases where they've been reported to ICE, for instance. And so, like, there's this threat, this fear that if you report injuries, then things can happen to you, and you can kind of be marginalized. And so, so I kind of laid out a little bit about why the conditions of these immigrant workers and what they face in the labor force, but it also one of the big things that's always missing from this is the employers. And I've done research. I'm currently working on a book right now on employers of undocumented immigrants, and I've done research on this topic because I was really interested in like what are the employers thinking? Like they're the ones hiring undocumented. I mean, there's 11 million undocumented, and there's many employers who are employing them, and they're not really at risk. The system isn't focusing on them, but they are really setting the stage about how they're treated and seen. And when I was doing research, I was out with another graduate student. We had clipboards and everything, and we were talking to day laborers, hearing about their stories. And then somebody pulled up and was like, "Are y'all looking for work?" And they wanted to recruit us and take us on their truck. And that's when I started thinking about, well, what is their view? What is their take on race and immigration issues and these problems, and how do they frame things? So I'm going to share a little bit about that research and how they view it, because I feel that they are kind of like a key political demographic that can like hold contradictory views, where they support immigrants and will fight for them even though they may not see them and treat them in humane ways. So employers are traditionally seen as job creators, and they hold significant power at job sites. They decide who gets hired, who gets promoted, those types of things. And folks have talked about how employers are very much focused on how to put migrant workers in the right positions, right? And how to create this thing called the brown collar workplace, where it's an overrepresentation of Latinos. You know, you go to any state, you go to any construction sites, and it's going to be predominantly migrant workers. And it's you know, it seems by design the type of people that they want out there. Many farmers or agricultural employers also are highly dependent on immigrant workers. They need them for the way that their businesses are run. And there's been many interesting times where they pass anti-immigrant bills and they put Americans out on the fields, and they complain because they leave after a day or two. You know, they're not they can't get them to stay, and so there's this like very big push to have them there. It's have a more reliable workforce. And so what I did was I did some interviews with 26 employers. I had walk-ins, snowball samples. There was 20 white employers, 5 Latinos, and 1 South Asian. I refer to them as the elusive employers because what they're doing is not legal, and they know it, but they don't want to share this information. And so you have to develop a lot of rapport. You have to connect with them so that they will want to talk to you about some of these issues. And sometimes they can be informal and talk about what's really kind of happening behind the scenes. And so what I'll do now is I'll share some findings, some interesting perspectives that some of these employers shared with me, and how they view Latino immigrant workers. The first is racial metaphors. And I have some quotes here from employers, just kind of the way they view them. So if you can imagine, if the way people are viewed is definitely connected to the way they may be treated and seen and paid and all that. And so I have an employer who mentions that the immigrant workers, they're machines, and we make jokes about it. We make jokes about them being machines, and it's true. They're machines. They're beasts. Another one says it's their nature to work hard, and they try really hard to keep us happy. It's what they know. It's their nature. So a lot of like essentializing of their work ethic tied to them. A lot of kind of this language about them being kind of dehumanizing language, them being machines or beasts. And a lot of the times it's said in a joking manner, and like the way that they frame them and see them as like this permanent workforce that will always be there to support them. What I was really interested or really fascinating by was many of these workers had a very positive view of Latinos, how their businesses would fall apart if they weren't there. These immigrant workers are very much what keep it alive. And I had to take a step back to read between the lines of why they're always praising them, why they see them as such positive light. And some of this is because of their subservience, of their hyper exploitative conditions that exist, and so employers will say stuff like, "Yeah, I mean, of course, any variety of Hispanic worker puts out a better product. They work harder, they work faster, they tend to be more punctual, they complain less," and so you get all of this like expected views of how immigrants are going to work, and this positive spin on them. So I was able to kind of track. It was pretty much unanimous. Everyone was going on about how these immigrant workers cause their businesses to stay afloat. One way to kind of understand the operation of race in the workplace, for instance, is how they compare to like white workers. And many of the white employers were upset with the white workers. They talk about white workers as lazy or complaining. And, again, between the lines, many white workers can speak up about their labor rights and can speak up about wanting better opportunities and mobility. And the employers, they don't like that at a construction firm or at an agricultural firm. They want, or a setting, they want to be able to control and be able to have a say over these workers. And so I had a restaurant manager talk to me about how you put a white boy in the kitchen, it's not going to get the job done. That sounds so racist to say, but it's so true. And so it's like this comparison that exists between like, we need a Latino immigrant worker, and they're the only ones who can get things done, and they're going to get it done without speaking up. Few more interesting trends here. Language markers of subservience. How some of the employers were sharing how do you control these immigrant workers? How can you like take advantage of them? And one of them shared a joke with me. He said it's a kind of a joke between contractors where they will say, "Man, you got to get the ones who don't speak English. Once they start speaking English, they're ruined." And there's a lot going on here because it's this idea that like if an immigrant worker speaks English, he's going to speak up about his labor rights, and you got to get the ones that are going to speak up. And so it's just like the behind the scenes of what's going on in these construction firms, and and this kind of informal way to decide who to hire, who to work with. You'd rather get a newly arrived immigrant than someone that's been here for many years and has more experience, and they're able to kind of justify the status quo. In terms of injuries, kind of earlier, as related to the earlier data I was kind of going over, employers are very much aware that their workers do not report injuries. Here's a construction employer. A Mexican guy won't tell you he's hurt. He will put duct tape on and get back to work because he needs a job. And so they're very, very aware of the conditions on the job and who's going to complain and who's not. He goes on to say, look, this is what he heard from another manager. Look, I need you guys to get some more labor. If they're going to get hurt, don't hire them. And then he said, don't hire white people. And so these are all white managers and employers coming together and like, well, we can't get some of these white American guys to come out and do these jobs. We need Mexican workers. We need immigrant workers. They're not going to complain, and they're going to allow the conditions to kind of stay in place. And again, this leads to a lot of like the internal ideas about race that going on behind the scenes and how this plays out in the workforce. Next, I started kind of pursuing like who gets promoted at these jobs, and suddenly like they're praising Latinos flips. They're not really good for management materials. They don't have the school right skill set. And then they start talking about they can't pass a background check. And so they have two different standards. They have this like low standard for the background check where like they don't really check their papers. Then they can do the most labor intensive jobs. But for management, it's like, no, we're not going to promote them. We're not going to, and we're going to look closer at their paperwork. So they kind of have this like contradictory way in which they're looking at papers. And also, I mean, not a lot of them were openly talking about race in this way, but some of them were kind of mentioning, you know, the reason that Hispanics don't have my job, like being a manager and employer, is because I'm a white guy. If all your bosses have always been a white guy, I feel like there's already a sense of authority established, and so there's already this like very strict hierarchy that exists. It's very, you know, caste based about who's allowed to be in charge of these businesses and who's allowed and what kind of positions they should kind of be in, which kind of helps us understand the way the labor force is kind of organized along these lines. And this is when it gets really interesting for me, because I started asking, well, how do you feel about Trump? How do you feel about anti-immigrant policies, right? And many of these guys, they were on the conservative side of things, and they were very like adamant about the government staying out of their way. We should be able to hire whoever we want, and you know, it's not my fault. This is the way things are. And so I had someone who was reflecting on the election of Trump. He was saying, you know, again, it sounds great. It'll get maybe somebody elected or something in terms of anti-immigrant policy. But, you know, in reality, I think businessmen are businessmen. And if he's a businessman like he claims he is, you know, he understands what's happening. So there's this idea that the smaller employer is in connection with these elites that are maybe even spewing out anti-immigrant perspectives, but they're willing to be like, well, we'll go along with the views and the perspectives, but we're keeping our workers. And then I pursued that. I was like, well, does this happen? You know, and which leads me to the concept. Sorry, a lot of concepts here going on in sociology, but a very important concept. This is by Derek Bell, interest convergence. The idea that social justice will occur when the dominant white group's interest overlaps with the racial minority group's interest. And the point I like to make is that employers, for all their like contradictory views of workers and the way they see them, it's a potential ally for an immigrant worker in terms of keeping them there. The last immigration reform we had was in 1986. This was the Immigration Reform and Control Act. It legalized 1.8 million, and we haven't had one since then. That's like 40 years. We're hitting 40 years by next year, right? 39, 49 years, 40 years since this happened. And the reason this passed was agricultural employers pressured Reagan, a Republican conservative president, right? He was the one that, you know, went for amnesty, or at least had that compromise where we're going to legalize some of these workers. And then ever since then, it's been political football. Nobody wants to touch it. But it was the agricultural employers. And then more recently, like comparing it to contemporary times, you had DeSantis fighting with the agricultural commissioner here in Florida about who's going to control, you know, what happens with immigration in the state. And it was the employers pushing back. you've even had Trump, even then during this like mass ICE raids where he's like, well, maybe the workers can stay on the farms and the employers will take care of them, because he's getting a lot of blowback from the business community. These companies, they rely on them, and it's going to hit their bottom line, and then that money talks. So it's like that entrance convergence comes through, and people can start to kind of see where they lie there. So again, it's bittersweet. The employers see themselves in this way. It's the way businesses are run. It's how these immigrants are treated behind the scenes. But at the end of the day, there's some political power here that may exist. Again, and so I'm interested in this research because of the labor force and their experiences with health, occupational health, and the kind of understanding their perspectives. But then in general, the employers, they significantly shape the setting, the conditions in the workplace. And there's more research is needed really to understand these ideologies and understand these working conditions for sure. But I'll wrap it up there. I kind of went through a whole lot of a typical lecture.
Thank you for that, Dr. Salinas. It's really interesting to see. I mean, I've never even thought about employers' perspectives on this topic, but really they play such a vital role and apparently have a lot of political power. So it's definitely interesting to see where they're coming from. And on that note, I guess we'll go ahead and open it up to the audience. If anyone has any questions to ask our speakers, feel free to ask a question to one speaker or to both. And if not, we can move into a guided Q&A.
I had a question. I think for both speakers, maybe Mr. Salinas can answer it better. I've kind of debated this immigration issue before, and I've heard that narrative of, they're taking jobs and things like that. I was wondering, I don't typically agree with that. I think they are the jobs that are typically underfilled, but someone did note something that kind of stuck with me, is that they do, like Salinas was saying, they do take jobs in conditions that have an effect of kind of lowering the overall wages available for people in America, and lowering those qualities of conditions for overall people in America. And I want to know what you think about that being an adverse effect of immigration. Does that warrant, wanting to limit immigration like we're doing now, or is that more something that can be regulated by, regulating employers?
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like either one of us could answer that, but I'll take a stab at it. So the argument about how letting the workers in causes wages to be lowered for everybody, right? And so yeah, I've definitely heard this one, but a lot of the times it's kind of like, if you look at it from the side of the employer, they're looking for any reason to kind of cut down on wages, and sometimes that can be, in a level playing field where it was all the same jobs people were taking. Maybe something like that could happen. But many of these jobs, they aren't really done by Americans. But the argument exists that if you kick all the immigrants out, that we'll suddenly have like livable wages on farms. And we barely have livable wages, for the middle class. And things are kind of getting worse economically speaking. But immigrants tend to sometimes take the blame for the immigrant downturns. You get this, the tick against anti-immigrant policies and things come through when there's an economic downturn. It's like this kind of blaming of them. So, but there is that perspective. But I don't. Again, I haven't looked closely at data that would support an argument from that side, but it does exist.
Yeah, there's lots of studies, and I think that it kind of depends on what part of the United States, what occupation and skill set you're thinking about. And so because for a long time, most people coming into the United States had relatively low levels of education compared to US natives, the focus was very much on this less than high school group, and whether it was leading to, like you said, lower wages and worse working conditions for competing US workers. And I think there's a clear consensus among economists that for competing immigrants, so people who came 5, 10, 20 years ago and are most similar to people coming now, additional influxes, particularly at the low end of the education or skill distribution, are competition. But for your average US born worker, not so much, because you tend to live in a different place, work in a slightly different job, and have different things to offer employers, from speaking English to having papers and a driver's license, a network, and so on. And so what you see on average, now there are exceptions, of course, but on average is that kind of among like US natives who didn't finish high school, some of them move into different occupations, different types of jobs when immigrants come into their area. Some move to other areas. And it doesn't hurt kind of your average US native, with again recognizing there are exceptions. And also recognizing that, as Professor Selena said, things are tough for a lot of people in the United States, particularly the working class. But I don't think immigrants are the correct group to assign blame. Instead, I would look at technological change and international trade, particularly the China shock, as being much, much more influential on what has happened economically to people who don't have a lot of education in the United States.
Looking at both of your presentations, don't we have a serious problem coming? I mean, is anyone looking at this problem? I grew up during the Bracero program, by the way, in California. And, most of my friends were somehow connected to the agricultural industry, many Mexican Americans. And I just, for the life of me, can't see why we can't come up with some program like that. Switzerland does it all the time. I mean, they control who comes in and who comes out, and if you have to have something like this. But from from the perspective of the labor economy, I just look at the statistics that were shared, and you just have to ask yourself, is anybody awake at the switch? Because it doesn't look good. Any thoughts, Madeline? Oh, I was wondering, Madeline, if you had any thoughts on what we're going to do downstream.
So unfortunately, my internet went out in the middle of that.
Oh, okay.
So I'm going to kind of guess what the question was.
Well, the question is, what are we going to do downstream? Is anybody looking at this problem?
We're going to have to import more, I think, particularly of agricultural goods, which is very interesting to think about in the context of tariffs and perhaps declining international relations with some important trading partners like Mexico and Canada, our nearest neighbors. And this is why I would particularly worry about the service intensive jobs, like the home health care aides, what we are going to do. And so I think sociologists, demographers, economists recognize this, but it's going to be policy solutions that are not popular with 40+% perhaps of the US population. Professor Salinas, what do you think?
Oh yeah, it's definitely a big problem. I mean, it's already happening in many other countries like worldwide. People that they have low birth rates, and so they don't have immigrants coming in, and all over Europe, and so it's definitely it's very isolating for for a country to just cut ourselves off from the world in that way and not have immigrants and then lead to these economic problems, not have enough people in the labor force, and then we're only accelerating it by trying to kick or push immigrants out of our society. So it's definitely, the pendulum will have to swing and things will have to get worse before people start thinking through, well, wait, we have to, how does our economy function? How does our society function without these workers and without this sort of connection we have? So yeah, it's a good question. It's we're a bit in the dark. It's hard to predict the future, but it's like we see the trends that are heading that way.
We have a question in the chat.
Yes, actually, I was just going to bring up that on that note, the question in the chat is particularly applicable. Jocelyn is asking, given the current decline in the immigrant population, is there a national or institutional strategy to prepare or educate American workers to fill roles that have been traditionally occupied by immigrants?
That's a really good question. Um, I don't know if there's something at the national level like it's there that's trying to address this, right? It's more let's get the immigrants out and let the market figure it out. And I don't, by what does that mean if everybody is trying to move up into the middle class and then they have these working class jobs? It's this long-term problem of a segmented labor market. And well, what Dennis Stone was talking about earlier, bring back the temporary work visa so that way there's at least some legal framework there, and then some sort of transitional period. But it's to this whole like take an axe and cut off everything, and that analogy, it's where it's extreme policy. We're just doge everything away and get rid of the existing infrastructure. What does that mean? But yeah, it's a good question. I don't know of any that they're addressing in that way.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is we're getting older as a population, and labor intensive jobs they're hard to do physically. I mean, just think about doing a whole day of yard work or something like that and how tired you are at the end of it. And then think about doing that hundreds of days a year. I don't know what we're going to do. I mean, part of it's going to be automation. We'll have more robot lawnmowers, and they're like University of Florida's horticultural or agricultural departments are supposedly, and lots of other universities, I'm sure, before they've lost research funding, have been working on trying to develop crops that can be picked by machines, by robots better. So hardier fruits and vegetables. So we're going to have things like that happen.
Yeah, I mean, definitely a big time of change for the United States. Jocelyn actually has another question in the chat similar about what can be done to incentivize Americans to fill these jobs. I don't know, Dr. Zavodny, you were just mentioning that maybe it's machines that are going to be partially taking these roles. Do you to see Americans, do you to expect Americans being willing to step into these roles?
No, definitely, like I said earlier, I don't think that's the way. I mean, forward, I mean, it's just if you look at the history of America, it's always been like, more people coming in and different groups, and so this idea of workers coming in, whether it's different Southern Europeans, the Irish, Italians, and then you had them start from the working class, and then they integrate, and then it's similar to Latin Americans now, or some, and so yeah, I don't know, in general what the I mean, if it's possible, it would have to be something large scale, or some sort of focus by the government for this training. But it's really seems like it's going in the opposite way, less involvement. Like the government is shrinking. It's not going to be expanding to train and fulfill these labor intensive jobs.
I really like the point that Leslie put in the chat about views are changing. And let's just hope that, our elected representatives in Congress do something, because as Professor Selena said, it's been almost 40 years since the last large scale legalization program. And one thing I didn't talk about before that I think is really, that the average American doesn't understand, the immigration system we have, I think they understand it's broken, but I don't think they understand how hard it is to enter legally. It is incredibly hard to get a green card. So hard. Unless you basically marry someone who's here, it's almost impossible. Marry a US citizen, in fact. It's very, very hard. And if you're trying to get a temporary work visa, there's caps on a lot of those programs. Employers find them very difficult to use. They're really complicated. You usually have to hire an attorney, follow lots of government, bureaucratic rules and so on. And so I think a lot of people probably have this view that, oh, well, you go down to the post office or the police station, or you show up and you fill out some paperwork and you can enter legally. That's not how it works. We've made it really hard. And because we've made it so hard and such a mess, it's going to be hard to fix. But we need to. I think that everyone agrees on that part. It's just doing the hard work.
I used to work for Immigration Legal Services for the Catholic Charities. And we set up, temporary protective status for hundreds of thousands of people and promised them that we would allow them to work towards getting a green card and potentially become citizens. In some cases, we made a deal, like with people in Afghanistan. And suddenly we've pulled the rug out from underneath them. So there's that whole aspect of this that I think we should probably have a follow-up discussion. I'm very interested in the groundwork that the two of you have laid for another discussion, and that is, what are some of the strategic plans that are starting to evolve, and how can we help facilitate those being further developed and successful?
Yeah, and on that note of sort of looking to the future, we're gonna go ahead and wrap up this really educational and I guess enlightening talk. Thank you both so much for your time. I learned a lot about the topic of immigration that I hadn't even heard about, and considered perspectives that I had never thought about. And I'm sure the same is true for our audience members. So thank you again, both, for your time and your willingness to share your research. And I'm going to pass it back to Dennis.
All right, thank you. And on behalf of the Jacksonville Urban League and the Center for Advocacy and Social Justice, I want to thank our guest speakers tonight. They really brought some important information to us and made it, and to me, it's made clear that we have to continue this dialogue. In fact, Leslie had another good comment. How do we get this information out into the conversation in ways that people can easily understand? This seems like an education or communications problem. So I'm thinking we need to do that, and I'm looking forward to, as I said earlier, getting some more dialogue on this. And also want to thank Eva and our other interns who made this possible, Samantha, who couldn't be here tonight, and also our coordinator, Sonia Barge, who makes sure the trains run on time and that we are meeting our commitments to our interns. So I want to thank you, Sonia. And with that, I'll say goodnight to everyone, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you again.
Thank
Good night,
you.
everyone.
Good night. Good night.
Good night. Make good trouble.